It's nice to see so many book lovers here early in the morning. My name is Barry Siegel. I'm a national correspondent at the Los Angeles Times and the author of both creative nonfiction books and fiction books. My latest book is Lines of Defense, which is a novel. I'd like to introduce our panel. Next to me, Mark Bowden is an acknowledged master of narrative journalism, has been for more than 20 years a reporter and now a columnist at the and also a staff writer at the Atlantic Monthly and a columnist at Philadelphia Inquirer. Author, among other books, of Killing Pablo and Black Hawk Down. His articles have appeared in many magazines, including Talk and Men's Journal and Sports Illustrated and Rolling Stone and The Atlantic. He's won many national awards for his writing, including the Overseas Press Club's Hal Boyle Award for Best Foreign Reporting. And if that weren't enough, Hollywood makes his books into movies. Poe Bronson, sitting next to him, doesn't need any introduction because he's got a big old bestseller sitting entrenched on the bestseller list right now. It's probably never going to go away. But Poe is the author of 4 books, 2 novels, and 2 nonfiction. He's written for the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and Wired. His current bestseller, What Should I Do With My Life? The True Story of People Who Answered the Ultimate Question, has taken him everywhere from Oprah to the Today Show. But before he hit that circuit, he had to follow another one. He traveled across the heartland of the country, finding and interviewing more than 900 people. And then he let his muse be the filter. When it came to Code 55, he used for this book. Orville Schell is the dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. He's also one of our foremost experts on China, a country he's visited many times since the early 60s. He's a master of an essay style which uniquely blends scholarship and journalism. The author of, if I've lost, latest count, it was 15 books. I'm not sure if I've lost. 15 books, 9 about China. The most recent is Virtual Tibet. He's also served as a television commentator for all the networks and has worked as a correspondent, consultant, and producer for a number of PBS Frontline documentaries. Longtime contributor to The New Yorker, and his magazine articles have also appeared in Harper's and The Atlantic and New York Review of Books. Top of that, he gets to live on a cattle ranch in Northern California where he raises chemical-free beef. Doesn't seem fair, but Rebecca Solnit is a writer who defies easy categorization, and I'm sure she wouldn't want it any other way. I'll call her a cultural historian, but you can correct that if you want. Whose work focuses on issues of environment, landscape, and place. Her 6 highly praised nonfiction books include Savage Dreams, A Book of Migrations, Wanderlust, Hollow City, As Eve Said to the Serpent, and most recently, River of Shadows. The New York Times called River of Shadows a brilliant essay that is all at once and in no particular order, a brief summation of a man's life, a meditation on time, image, and motion, a history of the American West as a fount of technological innovation and perceptual change, and a beautiful piece of prose. It's a pretty good combination. As you may have noticed, this is one of the reasons I took the time to do that pretty detailed introductions is we have a very disparate group of people sitting on the panel, different kinds of writing. One of the panelists sent me, sent me an email message saying what the 4 writers on this panel have in common has not yet revealed itself to me. I think that's a good way to start. I suppose one of the reasons we have such a group is maybe we're trying to demonstrate how wide-ranging is the category of creative nonfiction, or maybe how fuzzy. But let's start there. What is this? What is creative nonfiction? What are we gathered here to talk about? And Mark, why don't you define? Since you're sitting here next to me, you get
define creative nonfiction.
Yeah.
It's telling a true story with a. For me, anyway, it's telling a true story with the sort of due diligence of an historian or a journalist, but with perhaps a little bit more attention paid to making the work itself art, making the writing beautiful, making the book or article, whatever, something that has value in and of itself. And I think that's pretty much how I would define it. Oh?
Well, like Barry, who's written novels and nonfiction, one of the nice things that's opened up to me with nonfiction, or the great lessons lately, has been, I used to do research and then write novels, and when you're doing nonfiction, you kind of can't go to that point where now you can make the rest up. You've got to just stick with kind of what really happened. And the joy has been that in not being able to manipulate the story, to have to serve the story, you are taught more about how real life really unfolds, and how people really change their life, or what the real story of a city is, or a place, or a country. And that's there's a satisfaction in doing creative nonfiction that I get that I don't get with the fiction. I get different kinds of Joneses from the fiction, and I think it's not played up enough. Is that that you learn more about the character of real humanity by having to stick to what really happened, and not being able to manipulate it, but figure out why did that really happen and be able to explain it.
Go ahead, Earl.
Well, I guess like matter and antimatter, creative fiction is not uncreative fiction. I mean, this is a distinction that I wrestled with in trying to ponder what's worthy of being said here. But I think for me, one of the really crucial elements to writing this kind of fiction is the idea of a narrative, the idea that the writer is not simply reporting a freeze-frame event, but is actually taking the reader on something of a discovery. And it's to tantalize the reader a bit with the idea that there will be a destination without giving it away. I mean, one of the things that's most annoying about academic writing is that it'll start off, now I'm going to make 4 points, and then I'm going to tell you the following, and then there's a sound bite, and then you march off into this dirge of you know roughly where you're going to get. And I think good creative nonfiction wants to take you on something of a journey. And I think if it is longer form, to allow the writer to be present somewhat in that journey, not obtrusively, but I think it's paramount that a writer has to let the reader come to their own conclusions, even though the writer may know what conclusions are for us as we write it. Sort of a lighter touch. Finally, I'd say, this genre, as I've experienced it and as I've enjoyed it in reading others, it does require a certain length. It can't be done in very short form. And alas, the world is really in an attention deficit mode, and publishers are less and less inclined to allowing something to unfold and for a story actually to be told. And I think that tends to make it very difficult for the kind of writing I think that most of us enjoy doing, where you do have a little more leisure to be more descriptive, to be more narrative, and to have a kind of a shape of it that kind of concludes with the arrival at some destination.
I always found it a repulsive term. Nonfiction defines it by what it's not, which is fiction, so it sort of means everything else. And creative always seems like, oh, but it's good too. It's a term that always makes me cringe, and I also have mixed feelings about the way it's being roped into creative writing departments. I kind of liked it when it was out there roaming the savannah, unbranded and unlabeled, and but there's lots of it, and most of it is still nonfiction in the non-creative sense. One of the things that's of concern to a lot of us, I think, is that the boundaries are blurring between fiction and nonfiction in some really treacherous and problematic ways. But there's a lot of great stuff being written. I think it's kind of a golden age of nonfiction, if anybody, or whatever we're going to call it. I call myself an essayist a lot because it's an actual term for an actual thing, and I like the idea of an essay which has form and composition as a kind of métier, rather than the grab bag of creative nonfiction. But who knows? Maybe we'll find out what it really is this morning.
Well, it's interesting. Penn USA West out here has an awards program each year, and they have 2 categories. They have research nonfiction and creative nonfiction, 2 different. I understand the impulse. We're just trying to be inclusive and get more winners and such. But I've always tried to figure that out. Is the creative nonfiction doesn't involve research, and the research doesn't involve creativity? I don't know. But it seems to me that one of the things that might talk about a little bit is that everybody here has to do a lot of research before you before you can sit down and be creative, right?
It's true. I think, as Orville was saying, this form does, I think, require more space, and it's something I'm acutely aware of, having spent most of my career at newspapers where you can never get enough space. And I was always a real pain in the butt to editors throughout my career because whenever they gave me 25 inches of space, I wanted 30 or 40 or 50 or more. And so my whole life has been a progression of sort of battling my way to the point where I have a publisher who says it really doesn't make that much difference, although I have been told 500 pages is sort of a good rule of thumb to avoid. But but I think that in order to really tell a story in the kind of in real time, I always used to think as a newspaper reporter that so often the reports that I read all existed on a kind of abstract plane, where something would happen before some committee and at some government agency, and there was some issue at stake that had implications for these people or that people, but it was all this very abstract thing. And as a kid, I remember reading these kinds of stories and wondering, what does this mean? Where is this happening? So I've always been drawn to stories about real people, real action, real places. And in order to get that kind of information, it does require a great deal more, I think, legwork. You have to really spend time to get to know people, to understand not only what they did or said, but what the reasons are, their motivations, the motivations behind what they did. I think these are all the things that make what we call literary journalism or creative nonfiction so compelling and interesting. And it does require a major commitment, but to me that's always been part of the fun of it.
Rebecca, you talk about the writing department. So I'm less familiar with how it's taught in some of the writing departments, just because most of my teaching that I get to do is actual bookstores and things like that. Do they teach research as part of the creative nonfiction side in the writing programs, as well as the writing part? Do they teach them, get out there and talk to people and wander the earth and that kind of thing?
I'm not sure they do. And when I was looking to learn how to write, I ended up getting a degree from his school some years back, before it was his school. And what I loved, even though I'm doing stuff that doesn't always smell like journalism, is that there's an enormous sense of ethic, an enormous sense of what it takes to do it right, that I don't really see people who are also teaching fiction and poetry might, even know how to teach you about how to do research.
We're sorry, due to some technical difficulties, the next few minutes of this session were not recorded. We continue now with the session.
And I've actually written stories where I offer both accounts of what happened in this particular episode and maybe draw attention to it as saying, this was such a charged moment, this is such a critical point in this story that different people who were there for whatever reason remember it differently. And I find, it was a difficult thing to do at first because I felt like I was cheating somehow by not having arrived at a final determination. But in fact, I think it enhances not just the realism of the account, because in fact this is real life, that's the way things are, but also adds a sort of enticing tincture of ambiguity to events, which I think is always a really sort of a literary exciting in a literary way.
Another element that I think, and again, this requires a little extra space, that in the creative nonfiction, and that is description. If you look at nonfiction, there's almost an electromagnetic spectrum that begins with the AP wire copy, goes to the news story, then you get a feature, then you get a magazine story, then you get a long magazine story, a nonfiction book, and then...
I would agree with you when it comes to all the media forms that you mentioned, but I would much more agree with Rebecca that we're in a golden age in nonfiction when it comes to book publishing. That book publishers love true narrative stories for very clear reasons. It's a great story that they can promote, and that they can get notice of the book and the author on radio shows and on TV shows, and it's compelling and easy hook because it's real, and you can talk about what really happened. You don't have to talk about the fuzzy world of how you wrote it and the creative style, which is an unfortunate part of promoting it, but never like now have publishers been as voracious for true nonfiction books, and never have they succeeded as well as they have. And then we have now. And there's just a huge, huge demand for more. and people are buying them.
Yeah,
And it's working.
I also disagree with you, Orville. I think that whether it's a golden age or not, I guess depends on sort of a value judgment. But I think outlets for serious narrative journalism have always been relatively rare. Even when the New Yorker was in its heyday and doing these big long pieces, there weren't a heck of a lot of other magazines doing it. What I've found, and I've been doing this kind of writing for about 30 years, is that newspapers have completely adopted it. Virtually every newspaper in the country encourages its writers to write creatively, and while I do think in many instances narrative requires more space, it doesn't always. And I know some of the finest writers I know are writing for newspapers who prefer the shorter form of the 15, 20, 25-inch feature story in the newspaper, and there are gems that are written on an almost daily basis in newspapers around the country. On radio with NPR, you have very substantial narrative stories on a regular basis on any number of different programs. And on television, while I would have to agree with you with the networks and the 24-hour cable news programs, they're not offering anything like it. But nevertheless, there's never been so many channels on TV. I know that here in Hollywood, there's a bonanza for documentary filmmakers from channels like the Discovery Channel and A&E, the History Channel, Biography. Every night you can turn on your television and watch an hour-long biography of some, teenage movie star or rock star.
I would suggest that may be part of the problem.
Yeah. Well, again, I wasn't offering a judgment in quality, but the opportunity to produce, I think if you open up the opportunity for people to be creative, you get a lot of direct, but you also get, a lot of brilliant work.
Maybe.
I just challenge that long is the only form it can take. I'm teaching writing for the first time ever this semester, and I'm teaching essay writing, and I've been giving the students poems, because they're poems by people like Robert Haas that in 40 lines function as an essay, and then I think I love the idea that it's really fiction that's out there alone, and poetry's over on our side a lot of the time. But I also started writing a 1,200-word column for Ryan Magazine, and I kind of love it because it's about layout. You can't go over 1,200 words. And it's been interesting because the thing I was most used to doing was 90,000-word forms. And it's been really interesting seeing what happens in those short forms. And I think a lot of good things do. So that it's not so much about length, although there is definitely an attention span deficit in the country. National ADD, maybe.
I'll throw one more thing in that. Orville can defend himself, but we'll say, obviously there's a lot of very fascinating books and a great market for it. What I would call the sort of the reconstructed mini history kind of thing is obviously doing very well right now. But I think maybe partially what you're talking about is, it matters what you decide to write about. I can talk from the point of view of a newspaper, working on a newspaper. We most certainly are encouraged much more. The environment in terms of trying to just do narrative literary journalism is much more encouraging now. But the real question then is what are you going to write about? And I would say that there is still a pressure to write about what's on the large public stage instead of the private, instead of the personal. This reminds me of what you talk about the old New Yorker with the 90,000 words on week. But Sean abhorred trends and fads, and I think he never wanted to publish something if it was in the news. And to me, that's possibly part of what is so neat about a lot of the literary, the creative nonfiction, is that it like literature addresses the personal, the small, instead of what's out there in public, and that seems to me that venue is perhaps contracting. You don't have as many opportunities.
You must have missed the sort of the confessional or memoir fad in publishing, which pretty much it was like a tidal wave in the last 5 years, where people were confessing to all manner of nightmares in their personal lives and and their own foibles, to the point where it makes you nauseous.
Personal. I missed that on purpose.
Well, Barry, you said that there's pressure to write about what's on the public stage versus the personal, and because my personal story relates directly to that the current book that's out there now, which I do in my life, began when I was working down here in Hollywood, and I was writing for a show on the Fox network called The Street, and I had been a magazine writer for the previous 4 years, and I really had the magazine writer's filter, which is tune out all the ordinary and look for the freak stories, the special stories that are evocative of something larger, but look for the something that's big and that tunes into what's trendy and what's cool and what's being talked about. And I got overwhelmed by that, and our show was canceled that I was writing for to make way for Temptation Island. No small ego blow there. And the magazines, advertisers had pulled out of all the magazines. The magazines were really skinny, and there was no long-form journalism wanted right then. And I was out of work, and I had a baby on the way, and I needed to take care of my family. And I basically gave up on this notion that I had to filter out all the ordinary and find that special thing that would be headline worthy, no matter how I wrote about it, and just said, I'm just going to start traveling the country and talk to real people in Little Havana and in Mississippi and in far north of Canada and Pittsburgh and places I've never been, and East LA, and just record real people's real stories. And I feel like the success of my book is, I hope people will see in it an encouragement to find the drama in real life and not feel that pressure to have to come up with something headline-worthy or to feel like you have to compete with the headlines.
I think when you're competing with the headlines, in a way, you are the subject is sort of arriving from the outside to the writer, rather than the subject arriving from the writer and then seeking some receptor site in the outside world. I mean, that may be a fairly idealized view of things, but actually, I think one has to do both kinds of writing. But I think it's ever more difficult for the kind of thing that you did, which is somewhat idiosyncratic. It's not something that some Hollywood director or New York editor would get a sudden revelation about and call you up. It's something that you want to write about. I think those things are a little more difficult to do. If you have if you're well known and if you have a name, you probably have a lot easier chance to do it. But remember back. I mean, of course, this was before the broadcast world, but it used to be that even something like Life magazine had long pieces with great photographers. I mean, it's a wonderful form of writing to team that sort of combination up. Even magazines like Collier's had long pieces. And I think there's something here lurking, the distinction between sort of very niche, kind of elite markets, as you would call them, and mass markets. There's gotten to be a much greater distinction for sort of creative nonfiction, and the sort of elite market is what is really just about the only market.
What about, and then there's going back to your memoirs, the whole question of how and when to put yourself in a story. Let's leave the memoirs aside. But still there's putting yourself in the story in the first person, but a little separate from that is just the whole issue of how much of a narrative voice. Mark, I know you talked a little bit in the past about the different kind of a voice you or tone you used for Black Hawk Down as for your for the book about the football team. The football team. On purpose, you used a different kind of a...
Sure.
Your presence was different.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I always tell my... I teach a course in writing at Loyola College in Baltimore, and I tell my students that even when they don't place themselves as characters in the story, when they're not writing first person, they're in the story. Their voice is the voice of the story. And I think that if you're a careful writer, your choice of voice is a very deliberate thing. It certainly is for me. When I wrote a book about a pro football team called Bringing the Heat, and I spent 3 years with the Philadelphia Eagles football team. And to me, even though these guys took this sport and this game very, very seriously, and it was it was their life, it wasn't as deadly serious as the Battle of Mogadishu, where people were being shipped home in body bags. And it's basically pro football as a form of entertainment. And so when I chose a way to write that story, and because I was drawing on a lot of personal experience with these guys, there's a humorous narrative voice in that story where I'm trying to elicit laughs. I'm trying to see the humor in the situation. And while there are moments of humor in the story of a battle, certainly, it seemed to me a completely different kind of story. And for that one, I chose to try and pull myself and my judgments, let's say, or my interpretations, as far away from that narrative as possible. And I adopted, as a result, a very stripped-down, basic form of English, where I was just writing very simple declarative sentences for the most part, trying to be as direct and as clear as I possibly could be. And I think for every book and every story that I write, that's a decision that needs to be made at some point. I write myself into a story only when it's about me in some way. It becomes a clumsy, unnecessary thing when the writer injects himself or herself into a story where it's not really about them in any way at all. And that's the rule of thumb that I give for my students.
Well, I've done narrative nonfiction for magazines in which I have sort of done it by the rules, and the general rule that we hear is don't put yourself in the story. But with my books, I would be at the other end of the spectrum, where I have been soundly criticized for putting myself in the story for my nonfiction books. I think that in order to do nonfiction very creatively, you need to feel free to break the rule and make a conscious choice, whatever choice that may be. As Mark made two different choices with his two of his books. When I was writing about all the young migration of people to Silicon Valley, of whom there were 400,000 over the course of 3 years, and I was writing about them showing up at the airport in the middle of the night and following them for 4 years, I felt like the world would not care about these people at all. The only way I could get readers to care was if, sort of through my perspective, that there's an old rule in fiction, which is that if you care about your characters, don't worry, the readers will care. And if you don't care about your characters, readers will smell it, and the writing will feel very cold and distant. And so I found people that I could care about, and through that try to make that world come alive. And again, with my most recent book, I put my own journey into the book amongst 55 people's stories. And I think I made a very clear and difficult choice to do so, and I've been criticized for it, but I knew it was important. And it was important because when I went out to interview people, they would ask me about my life just as I would ask them about theirs. And I found myself, while traveling the country, thinking about my life a lot. And it was, to be true to that passage, it was part of what happened. And I could have backed out of it and taken it out of the story, but it would have been honest. It would have been dishonest to take myself out. And I think that there's something about just letting the truth be what's true and working with that.
Thoreau once remarked that if he could know anybody else that well, he wouldn't write about himself all the time. And I think sometimes when you want to write about sort of very subjective, complex experiences, you're the only laboratory rat around. But the sort of big breakthrough for my writing happened. I was going to the Nevada test site a lot to protest nuclear testing, and it was a place that was so complex in which so many histories converged and so many things came together. The history of the peace movement, the history of direct action, nonviolence, which is Thoreau's history in part, the history of the Western Shoshone, the history of the making of the atom bomb, the history of white attitudes towards the desert, and things that it demanded a voice I didn't have yet. And I realized that the sort of lyrical, obscure first-person voice I was writing personal essays in, and the kind of critical voice I was working in as an art critic, and environmental journalism I was doing really didn't have to be three separate things. They could be the same thing. And I've been mostly writing in that sort of hybrid voice where the first person can show up when it's relevant ever since. Another big influence for me is that I was around a lot of postmodern theory in those days, and the general premise was that there's no, which I think I also got from journalism school, come to think of it, there's no such thing as objectivity, but there's such a thing as honesty, that you couldn't pretend to have the God's eye view, but you could be a lot more honest by establishing what your own particular view was in relationship to something. And then a lot of times using the first person was a way to give a really specific take on some of the strange things that happened, on things that you couldn't tell any other way. And a lot of times there were specific encounters and interactions that were really part of the story as I was telling it, although there are clearly other stories out there. But what was surprising to me is I got really sick of the first person and decided I was going to write a book without it. And My last book, the protagonist dies in 1904, which precludes a lot of use of the first person without quotation marks around it. But what's surprising to me is by the time I was done, I realized that I was all over it in every sentence, that my attitudes towards technology, my fascination with the Indian Wars, my interpretation of photography, that all these things were enormously, enormously present, and that the first person was, an optional way to be present because you're always present.
Exactly. Tell me, I'm always curious. I think we all learn. All writers learn by reading. Sometimes we steal from. I'm curious for all of you. First of all, just what is it that drew you to this kind of writing, and who were your models when you were, or who are your models for that matter, also?
Well, I think one thing that makes this kind of writing so wonderful and very addictive is that when you get used, a little like being a photographer, when you get used to seeing the world through a lens, it's very hard to put the camera down. And when you're a sort of a nonfiction writer, you learn that it's a fantastic way to be in the world because people react to you in a very different way. You have a reason for being there. You're not just a tourist. You're not just aimlessly wandering around. They'll take time to talk to you, explain things to you. You make amazing friendships, and you get into amazing worlds. And it is kind of the ultimate form of tourism, in my view. So I think, for me, this revelation was a really profound one. I was a young student out in Asia studying Chinese, and I discovered went to Indochina, that if I was writing, I could do anything. I could go any place. People would feed me. I could get on military aircraft. I could get myself killed. I could, you always had a reason to be wherever it was you wanted to be. And it was a wonderful way to, as I say, to be in the world.
Ricky, you want to answer that?
You go ahead.
Well, I grew interested in, I was always a reader, and at first an avid reader of comic books, to be truthful, and Bible stories and things which my parents gave me as I was growing up. But when I was in college in the early 1970s, I was an English major, and I had this vague idea that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't really quite know what I wanted to write or what direction to go. And that just happened to be a period where there was this tremendous flowering of creative nonfiction writing, and writers like Tom Wolfe and Gay Talese and John Hersey and Norman Mailer, Truman Capote, were publishing articles in magazines and publishing books that I found at that moment to be a whole lot more compelling and engaging than the literature that I was reading, the so-called literature, the fiction. And I decided that's really what I wanted to do. In more recent times, I've probably been, because I'm getting older, I guess I get influenced by my peers. I'm really a big fan of a writer named Richard Ben Kramer, who's a good friend of mine, whose work I think is just brilliant. And recently became acquainted, sort of belatedly, with the Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski, whose work has had a tremendous influence on the way I think about writing stories and sentences. So, there's more to that, but that's the nutshell.
Well, speaking of Kapuscinski, that I never know how to say his name, but
That's right.
But there's a good point there, which is that I don't have a lot of models when I'm working with a big project, but just one or two will work. And when I was writing about, as I mentioned, that sort of migration of people to high tech, Kapuscinski's book about 4 decades in Africa and how the culture was slowly turning into independence and then sort of breaking down. The literary style of how he covered the entire continent and the personal stories they told as well as the political blew me away, and that was one of my strongest models for that type of work. So your models don't have to seem remotely similar in substance. It's the creative model, not the content model in that way. And you get a lot of excitement out of that. From my most recent book, I was recording all these stories and thought I knew how I wanted to tell them and what I wanted to bring across, but I could not find any models. And the closest things to me were Oliver Sacks' work and Irvin Yalom's work. And eventually, what I did is it was on radio, and it was This American Life, and I would see they'd tell a whole story, and they'd find a segue that was really interesting, and you felt like each piece was a story, but you felt like the whole hour was a story too, and you went on a journey over the course of the hour. And so your models can be not just even in the other books, it can be different forms of media as well. But I do use those models, like I just seat myself in them, and they give me confidence, and they help me stick it out, because writing a book takes so long that they give you that confidence to keep going.
You can't duck this, Rebecca.
Sure. Yeah, I had one of those books when I was growing up that you put your report cards in and how tall you are and stuff, and there's not really a little box to check next to nurse and teacher and mother that says cultural journalist, obscure lyrical left-wing niche. So you sort of like, I think a lot of us become things that there weren't even concepts for when we were kids, or that at least we didn't have concepts for. I think my story about the test site making me realize that I could bring all these things together is a lot of kind of how it came together. But for models, and a lot of them are unlikely. I really agree with Poe. I think Borges and Isaac Dinesen have always been really big influences on me, even though I'm clearly miles apart, and there's a whole journalistic and sort of research angle that's a little different than what they do. And for different pieces, different things inspire me. And a lot of times you're writing against things. I wrote Savage Dreams, my book about the test site, writing against, I was always like, okay, Annie Dillard, who's dumping what upstream on Tinker Creek? I wanted to sort of write this political stuff into the landscape that had been very carefully written out of it by nature writers. So a lot of times you're writing against what's been written too, I think. But there are tons of amazing people, from Mike Davis to Walter Benjamin to Annie Dillard, who've been influences on me, and people pop up periodically. You sort of wish you'd done that. There's a guy who's not that well known, Wolfgang Schivelbusch, whose book The Railway Journey was a huge influence on River of Shadows, for example. It's a brilliant book about the way that the railroad transformed the perception of time and space in the 19th century. So lots of stuff is the short version.
Breakthrough in the way nonfiction is done, at least on the air. I mean, these wonderful little worlds he gets into and just follows. They're so captivating and so well done. You just wonder, why hasn't anybody done this, before? A little 20-minute segment on, I remember one I heard recently, people who just stand outside of other people's houses and pray. But it wasn't done with contempt. It wasn't done with mockery. It was done out of kind of a curiosity of who are these people and what kind of lives do they lead. It's truly marvelous. I mean, I think that is the kind of thing that when you run across it, you really do feel sort of profoundly influenced.
What's wonderful for me about that program is that it assumes people are really intelligent and complicated and will respond to those things, and they do. It's a huge success. Whereas it seems like so much of what we get, including a lot of sort of fictionalized nonfiction, assumes that people are really dumb and need to be kind of spoon-fed in bite-sized pieces of something that's not too hard to chew.
Just get ready. I'm going to try to make this interactive in a minute, okay? We have microphones set up over there, and start thinking of some questions, because I want you to join the conversation, okay? I want to ask you, everybody, one other thing, though. I spend a lot of my time trying to decide which part of writing is the hardest. Trying to decide what to write about, getting the story, trying to understand what the story is once I'm back at my desk, structure, tone, language. For all of you, I'd love to hear the hardest part. Yeah.
Well, it's all hard, but it's also all fun, and I think that's why I love doing it. To me, the hardest, I'll actually tell a little story. When I was a young reporter, I was interviewed once for a job that I didn't get at the Washington Post by Ben Bradley. And Bradley was charming and asked me a lot of questions about the work I had done in the past. And at one point he said, well, what's your biggest weakness? And so I very forthrightly thought about this for a minute, and I thought, I think I'm a better writer than I am a reporter, because it's harder for me to do the reporting than it is to do the writing, and I'm always happiest when I've finished or gotten nearly finished with the reporting, and I can sit down and start to write. And so Bob Woodward, who was actually the person who was trying to hire me, called me the next day in my office in Baltimore and said, "Mark, you idiot, why did you tell Ben Bradley that you're a lousy reporter?" And, of course, I didn't think I was a lousy reporter. I was just trying to be really honest. At this point in my career, I think I've gotten better at the reporting. Probably the most difficult thing for me is conceptualizing the story. Out of all of the massive material that I gather, and I do tend now to work on big projects that last a long time, all the while you're doing that, you have to be thinking, where is the story in all this mess of information? How is it going to be organized? And that's, I think, for me, again, I like doing it. It's a challenge, but it's the hardest thing for me to do. And once I've got it, once I have a general idea of how I'm going to organize the story, where the beginning is and where the end is, then for me it becomes more of an easy joy to sit down and pull it all together.
Most of the aspects of writing are extremely challenging and use my brain and my heart, but they're not really difficult situations to navigate. They're just wonderfully hard challenges to work through. The hard thing for me, I realize now, has been when I've used someone's life, a life really lived to a certain end with best of intentions often, and I think rightly so, criticize it, or I call it for what it is, or I see beyond what that person sees, or I see their world differently than they see it, and I'm waiting for that email or that call where that person's like, "You told my story really differently than I see it," and that hurt, and that confrontation looming over my work is, and knowing it's like you got to go kind of take your bruises, and that you hurt somebody. That looms hard on me as I get older and I relate to people differently than I used to. It used to be easy for me to make fun of people. I make fun of lots of people, but it's not easy for me anymore. Yeah.
I think, every writer, when you start, you have a kind of a vague idea, or maybe even a clearer idea of where you want to go. You rarely end up in precisely that point. So usually halfway through, and particularly this is true of books, you have this giant mass of sort of undigested material, and it is very painful just to get it out, and you look at it and you realize it's just like a big lump of clay, and you've got to find how to shape that, and I think that's the most difficult time for me. And then after that, after you find the river that wants to flow through it, then it gets fun again, and you actually start, as Mark said, to be able to kind of write, as distinguished from transcribing notes, from just roughly organizing things. And then you begin to see where it is you probably have intended to go and will go.
I'm with Mark. I think it's all incredibly hard and incredibly fun. And I think I'm also with Mark in that sometimes I look back and think, I should have done more interviews instead of sticking with the library. But I have a friend who's a world champion black belt in Shotokan Karate, and we once were driving around and came up with the theorem that you just work incredibly hard for a really long time and then it becomes effortless. And, and I think some of the time, there are moments when it's effortless and it seems like it's what you're supposed to be doing. So, but I don't know. The only things that get annoying are things like fixing footnotes and arguing about book jackets and stuff. There's production stuff, but there's no part of the research and writing that isn't a joy.
So start, if you guys have questions, there's microphones here, and welcome you to join in the conversation, okay? Go ahead, you got there first.
Hi, I did indeed. Can you speak to the problem of attribution? In other words, how do you tell your audience that you're speaking about factual material while keeping the narrative flow and without using too many footnotes?
Well, one of the things that, when I was writing for the newspaper, there was I think a very useful solution sometimes for longer narratives was just to run a sidebar or a box alongside the narrative explaining how this story was reported, where the sources are from. And that eliminated the need for a lot of attribution within the narrative itself. And then in my books, I've found, and I'm really surprised that more nonfiction writers don't do it, to have detailed source notes is a very useful way of resolving the problem of just inserting attribution all the time in the story. So that, for instance, my books, Black Hawk Down and Killing Pablo, if you choose, you can go to the back of the book and literally for every line in the narrative, you can see where that information came from.
Yes, I would like to ask, doesn't Truman Capote and In Cold Blood, wasn't he the grandfather of this category?
It was too creative.
No, that was a brilliant book.
And it's an absolutely brilliant book, but it's not nonfiction exactly, and it's where where the fence straddling gets really treacherous. And I think it's an amazing work, but you see a lot of much more sort of pop science history nowadays, where people clearly are making things up. They don't really know what so and so thought as this train was going through the tunnel on the way home, and they can't really live with the fact that they don't know it and we don't know it, so they just kind of make it up. And, there's a huge number of books out there in a sort of science, popular history way that make a lot of stuff up, and they might as well write novels, because at least then you know that you can rely on that they made things up rather than try and rely on that they didn't. And so I think In Cold Blood is magnificent, but it's a really dangerous example. And
maybe we can give him a little credit because he was out on a frontier when he did it. But
Yeah.
No rules then, right?
He
Yeah.
wasn't really the first. Actually, John Hersey wrote some brilliant pieces for Life magazine back in World War II. And there are examples that go back literally centuries of writers from the Civil War era, for instance, who wrote just brilliantly creative journalistic accounts of what was going on. Of course, you have given the breadth of this panel, the tradition of essays in the English language is as old as the language is itself.
The frame of this is creative nonfiction and the internet. And before I came today, I got on Google and Googled all of you, and whatever the missing connections are, they can actually be unraveled, sort of.
Oh, enlighten us.
And scanning through here, the thing that stuck out to me is in the terms of creative nonfiction and the internet. Mark Bowden, when you were writing Black Hawk Down, you serialized it in the newspaper, printed it on the newspaper, got feedback, clarified some errors, and then rewrote based on the feedback. So this sort of a collective enterprise of finding the truth that'll let the internet provide part of. I'm going to stick a quick nudge at Dr. Dean Shell in this, is that I think he once wanted to teach a course on rewriting things 10 times. Now,
At least.
Now, I want to, if he can, think about the concept of you get on the internet to find the truth amongst people, but if you rewrote it 10 times before you did that, you'd be rewriting the mistake. I leave it to you to make some sense out of that comment.
Well,
I don't approve of mistakes, first draft, second draft, third draft, any draft, but I do think that, things do really get better the more you rewrite them. And there's one thing I teach my students is, when you hand that paper in on a scale of 1 to 10, you're usually at 2 if you're lucky. And you just have to keep grinding away at it, and it'll get better and better and better. And you will discover what it is you really intend to say, which you probably didn't really fully comprehend in the first and second drafts.
But the conversation with the people out there, I guess, I was
Well, in answer to your question, it's true that the book Black Hawk Down was originally an extended newspaper serial, which also unfolded daily on the internet. And that proved to be just an invaluable process for me, because literally on a day-to-day basis, everybody in the world could take a shot at my manuscript. And as good as I thought I was, I did make mistakes. And what's terrific about the internet is that if you write for a newspaper, as I had for many, many years, and you make a mistake, someone will send a letter or make a phone call. And the best you can do is give them a little line or two in the paper a couple days later, usually buried on page 3. But if they make a correction to a story that's on the internet, they come back the next day and you've made the correction and you've thanked them for it by email. And what that did, I discovered for me, because I'm not a military person and I'd never written about the military, and this may come as a surprise to you, but journalists are not held in high regard by the United States military. The fact that I responded so forthrightly and was so grateful for the corrections that I received, and they could see me working to make the story better, made a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't have had any respect or trust for me come forward and offer to help. And so when I did then sit down to write the book, I had the advantage of all of these additional contexts that I'd made because the story first aired on the internet. Very valuable process.
We've got just a couple minutes, so
The documentary filmmaker Steve James, who made Hoop Dreams, has a new movie called Stevie, and when you meet the central character, you can't imagine spending 2.5 hours with him. The director becomes a character in the story. Took him 5 years to shoot. Mr. Shell was saying that creative nonfiction should be a journey of discovery, and I'm wondering for any of you all if you have stories or advice about, since you have such limited time in our lives, to really find that story, and has there been a discovery that turned your book completely around to being about something that you did not start out to write?
Well, I've even written books that have absolutely nothing whatever to do with what I started out to write. I mean, the topic entirely changed because it just stopped interesting me. I mean, I think that's, the most extreme form, but I think it happens all the time.
Yeah, and I don't think you can fully know what the story is going to be until you've done the reporting and research. It's that journey, and literally even until you start the writing, because even though you may have done a ton of research, you don't really know what you think about it until you go through the process of thinking it through, and that's what the writing process is about. Writing is the discipline of thinking something through very deliberately and often at, in my case, great length.
I'm really sorry. I've just been told that we don't have time for more questions. But thanks you all for coming here today.
If you would like to have a book signed.
This is the end of side 2 and concludes this presentation.